Hi all, welcome to the video lecture series of object-oriented programming. In this video lecture, we'll be discussing about the topic, the throws keyword and how it is used in exception handling in Java. We use the throws keyword along with the method signature. That is when we declare the method along with the method header. That means the line in which we mention the method name, return type and the method parameters. Along with that, we'll be using the throws keyword. So there's one difference between the throws and throw keyword. Throw keyword is used within the method, but throws keyword is used along with the method header. And throws keyword, the syntax of throws keyword is like this. That is, we know the method signature, that is access modifier, that's public, private or protected. Then the return type, that is void or int or float, whatever it may be. Then the method name. Then there can be a parameter list inside that pair of parentheses. And along with that, we'll be using the throws keyword to mention the exceptions. So when we write like this, what we mean is we can declare multiple exceptions by using the throws keyword. So when we write a method and along with the method name, if you write throws and multiple exceptions here, that means this method is capable of throwing these exceptions. That is, when we call this method, we can expect any of these exceptions to be raised by any lines of code inside the method. That is the meaning of this throws keyword. So as you can read this method throws exception 1, exception 2. That means this method is capable of throwing any of these exceptions listed here. So this method is capable of throwing means the lines of code that is written inside this pair of curly brackets can generate any of these kind of exceptions. That is the meaning of, or that's a usage of throws keyword to mention the exceptions that this method, that a particular method can generate. So it gives an information to the programmer. That means when we call the method, it gives the programmer an idea what kind of exceptions he can expect from that method. So he must be ready to handle it. So that is the intention of this throws keyword. So it gives information to the programmer that there may be an exception when we call this method. So we must be responsible, or we must be ready to accept. So what's the need of having throws keyword? Because we have the try and catch block to handle exceptions. So what's the need of this throws keyword then? So for this we'll see an example. Suppose we have a method. Let the name of the method be my method. And it has got statements that it can throw either an arithmetic exception or null pointer exception. So as we have studied earlier, we'll be writing those lines of code inside the try block. And as mentioned, this method or those lines of code may generate arithmetic exception or null pointer exception. So we'll be writing two separate catch block. One catch block for catching arithmetic exception and the other catch block for catching null pointer exceptions. So this is the case with only one method. Okay, so now this is the situation. We have one method which is capable, in which there can be null pointer exception or arithmetic exception, and we have written the try catch block for handling those kind of exceptions. Now what if we have multiple methods like that? We have several other methods like my method one, and as in the previous slide, we have several other methods which are capable of generating exceptions. So if we try to write try and catch block in those methods also, the length of the program will be huge. The number of lines of code will be very huge, and it will become very tedious to write these try and catch block in all these methods. So what we are doing is, instead of writing all this try and catch block in each of these methods, what we are doing is we'll be declaring the exceptions in the method signature using throws keyword. Okay, so along with the method signature, along with the method name, we'll be listing the exceptions the method is capable of generating by using the throws keyword, and from where we are actually calling the method, we will handle the exception there. So when we write the method, there is no need to write try and catch block inside the method. We just want to list the exceptions the method will generate. Okay, whoever is calling the method must be responsible for handling the exception. Okay, so another advantage, as I mentioned just now, we'll be forced to handle the exception when we call that method. So when we call that method only, we have to think about the exception. Suppose I have 5 methods. All these 5 methods will be generating exceptions. So if I am listing the exceptions along with each method name by using throws keyword, okay, I want to handle the exception only when I call those methods. I don't want to think about the try and catch block inside that method. Suppose I am calling method 1 and method 1 will, and it's mentioned along with the method header, method 1 throws arithmetic exception. In that case, I have to handle arithmetic exception only when I call the method 1. I don't have to think about anything else. Also, suppose I have another method, say method 2. Method 2 is generating or is capable of generating array index out of bounds exception. I have to think about handling array index out of bounds exception only when I call the method 2. So instead of writing try catch block inside each method, we will be listing the exceptions that each method will throw along with the method signature by using the throws keyword. And whoever or from where we are actually calling the method, that portion of the program must be responsible for handling the exception. That is the usage of throws keyword. So this will how the throws keyword look like, or how to use the throws keyword. That will look like this. We have a method named my method, and along with the my method I have mentioned that this method will be throwing arithmetic exception or null pointer exception. Okay, I have not included any try or catch block inside the method. So inside the method we are actually writing those lines of code that method will perform, nothing else. But we have mentioned that the lines of code that we write inside this method may generate an arithmetic exception or null pointer exception. As we can see, can include multiple exceptions. We can mention multiple exceptions by using throws keyword separated by comma. So whoever is going to call this method my method must keep in mind that this method will be generating either an arithmetic exception or null pointer exception. There is a chance of generating those exceptions. So see here, when we write the main method, we are calling the my method from here. So from the method signature here, it is clear that this method will be generating. There's a chance of arithmetic exception or null pointer exception when we call this method. So I have to write the method call statement inside the try block. And see where we are writing the try block. We are using the try block only when we call this method. We have not written the try and catch block inside this method. The portion of the program where this method is invoked, there we have to use the try and catch block, because it is clearly mentioned here that there is a chance of arithmetic exception or null pointer exception that is being generated by this method. So whenever this method is being called or invoked, okay, there is a chance of arithmetic exception or null pointer exception. So which portion of the program is going to call this method must be ready to handle such an exception. So to handle such an exception, what we have to do, we have to write the method call statement inside the try block, because calling this method is what going to generate an exception. If you are not calling this method, then there is no need of handling the exception, right? So whenever we call this method, there is a possibility of arithmetic exception or null pointer exception. Possibility, it's not compulsory that it has to generate an exception. Okay, always there's a possibility. So since there's a possibility of generating this arithmetic or null pointer exception, we must be ready to handle it. So what we are doing is we will be writing the method call statement of that method inside a try block. So when this method call statement is generated, the control will be jumping to this method. All the lines of code inside this method will be executed, and if any line inside this method generates an exception, that exception will be thrown back to the point from which the method was called. I repeat, if any lines of code inside this method generates an exception, that exception will be thrown back to the line at which this method was invoked. We know that this is the line of code that invoked this method. So if an exception is generated here, there is no try and catch block inside this method. So the exception raised must be handled by somebody, right? So since there are no try and catch block here, the exception raised here will be thrown out of the method. Okay, it will be thrown out of the method back to the point from which the method was invoked. That means the exception generated will be going back to this try block. So since the exception is raised inside the try block, the remaining lines of code, if any, will be skipped, and it will be, the exception that is generated will be thrown out of the try block. It will be catched by the arithmetic exception here, by the catch block written here. If it is arithmetic exception, it will be caught by this catch block. If it is null pointer exception, it will be caught by this catch block. So this is how the throws keyword work. I hope you got an idea now. So this is another example of using throws keyword. So here we have written one class main. Inside that we have two methods, that static void find file and static void main method. And as it is mentioned here, this method find file may generate an exception named IOException. So when we call this this find file method, we must be taking care of that. That is, we must be responsible to handle the exception if it is raised. When we mention it by using throws keyword, it's not compulsory that this method have to generate this exception anyway. When we use throws keyword, it means that there is a possibility of this exception inside this method. That is the meaning of throws keyword. So when we call this method, we must be responsible for handling it. So this method find file is actually called from the main method from here. So since this method call may result in an exception, we have to write that method call statement inside the try block, because try block is a block inside which we have to write the lines of code that may generate an exception. So this method call may generate an exception. Why? Because it is mentioned here. This method is capable of throwing IOException. So this method call statement may generate an IOException. So we have to write that method call statement inside the try block. So now inside this method, if any of these two lines generate the IOException, that exception will be thrown out of this method. Out of this method means that exception will be thrown back to the line from which the method was invoked. The method was invoked here. So the exception that may be generated here will be given back to the line of code from which the method was invoked. That means this line of code. This line of code is actually inside the try block. So since it is inside the try block, okay, the exception raised will be thrown out of the try block and it will be caught by the catch block written here, and it will print system.out.println that exception whatever it is caught. So when we execute this program, we will be getting this exception. In this case, I have not created a file named test.txt. So here we are actually trying to link the object new file to a file that does not exist already. So in that case, here this line will generate an exception, and that exception will be thrown to this line, because this is the line from which this method was invoked. As you all know, this is the first method that is going to be invoked. So main method will be working first of all. So the execution of the program will begin from the main method. So this line will be executed first. So control will be going to this method. Inside this method, we are trying to link the object new file with the file name text.txt. Since there is no file name text.txt, an exception will be raised, and that raised exception will be given back to a line of code from which the method was invoked. So the exception reaches here. Since the exception is within the try block, then that exception is thrown out of the try block. Then this catch block is waiting for that exception, and that exception will be caught here, and it will print that exception. Okay, and since we are printing that exception, we are getting this message as the output. I hope the throws keyword is clear to you, and how to use it is also clear to you. We have seen two examples. We shall conclude now. So we discussed about the throws keyword, what's the purpose of throws keyword and where to use it, and what's the difference between throw and throws keyword, and some of the examples also we have seen. I hope it's clear to you. That is all in this video lecture. Thank you so much.